So I'd like to continue with the unconventional policy. So with the material that we cover initially, we're going to be a little more. Don't take what I say as given. We need to get into this practice of they don't know any better. I can think of my own. I have a different viewpoint. How come your viewpoint is better than mine? It's something that we need to nurture. It's an acquired taste. It is not something that comes naturally. My personal problem has been is that I don't trust anybody. And so, okay, fine. And so, no big deal. And so when I'm reading a textbook or when I'm reading some article, I don't trust a thing they're saying. It's not that I don't trust, but they're telling me there are unicorns in Paris, and you will see them if you just can get there. And so the issue is, can I get there? My problem is that not only I don't believe what they're saying, I believe that there's an error in what they're saying. There's a mistake. And so I then spend hours chasing the mistake. Of course there's no mistake, right? But now the advantage of believing that everybody has a mistake is that once you convince yourself that no, I am the one that is mistaken, you learn a lot in the process. Because you saying there's an error here, or how do they know this? So you start, well, no, there has to be an error. So I'm convinced that there's an error. And it takes me a while to convince me otherwise. And I happen to learn a lot in the process. Okay? You don't have to take things to that extreme. First of all, you're brighter than I am. And so even if you were to say there's an error there, it will take you about 5 minutes to say, no, there's no error. It takes me 5 hours to reach that point. So you don't have to be that extreme. But I enjoy it. Because when I get the error, when I see the error, then an entire life is validated right there and then. So you will see what I mean by this today. Okay, so this is where we were last time. Normally, and Ariel, this is going to get, I think, to the question you raised about inflationary expectations. What happens is that we believe that economic activity is ultimately driven by a real long-term interest rate. And the real long-term interest rate is driven by the gap between the long-term nominal minus the expected inflation. Notice that what this is doing is essentially rewriting the Fisher equation. The Fisher equation tells me that the nominal equals the real plus the expected inflation. So I'm not doing anything new. Then that takes us to the question of, well, how is the long-term nominal determined? Then we say, well, it's determined by the sum of a short-term rate plus a term premium. And it is at this point that Jason brought the last time, should this be compounding or should be additive? And I'm just going to leave that aside. The next step is to say, okay, so this is how it works. So conventionally, we would say a monetary policy that wants to expand economic activity will try to lower the short rate, that would then lower the long rate, that would then lower the real rate, and that would raise economic activity. So that's the thinking. Okay, you can imagine that putting the break in the channels at any of these points will create a problem. The glitch is this: what happens when the short rate is 0 or 0.2? It's 2 basis points or 4 basis points, something really small. Well, then this line of this channel doesn't work anymore because the short rate is 0. Now, and we also talk about, well, can the interest rate be negative? And the answer is no. The interest rate cannot be negative because if it were negative, it could be, if you tell me that I'm going to put money into a bank and the interest rate is going to be negative, and then I don't put the money in the bank. David? We're okay? Okay. Now, at this point, we have two options. Option one, or when I say we have two options, these are at this point mostly theoretical. The first one is, let's expand currency in circulation, and we call that the liquidity channel. And the other one is called forward guidance, which is, I'm gonna call it a signaling channel. Expanding the currency in circulation involves the central bank buying short-term treasury bills and paying for them in cash, little, okay? And so you can imagine that this is just not, you can imagine the institutional complications that are gonna arise between a central bank wanting to buy something and then paying in cash. Well, let's abstract from that, okay? And so, this side of the asset side, this side of the balance sheet increases, this side of the balance sheet increases, so we maintain the balance sheet in balance. Balance. The argument for pursuing this approach is that an increase in currency circulation has to be held by someone, otherwise it will not be in circulation. It is not that we're going to increase the amount of money printed and put it into a vault and leave it there and then hope for some magic trick. The increase in currency has to be held by the public. The argument then continues saying that public with more money in their pockets is a public that will spend more money. Therefore, there's going to be an increase in economic activity. Okay? Here's the glitch. Why would you sell your, just to make this tangible, imagine that the central bank sets up a collection of little windows in every CVS, or every 7-Eleven, or every little outlet, right? Where you can bring your treasury bills there, and the same way that you can bring a Colgate coupon, you bring your treasury bills, and they give you cash, right? So let's assume that we can do this, or you can go to the post office. That's probably a little better. It has this thing about being a government, right? Why would you do that? For the sake of the nation, some patriotic appeal? Well, the guys in economics don't like that all that much. And they say, you know, in order for me being willing to give you my treasury bills, you need to give me a better price than the one that I paid for. Otherwise, I do not have an incentive to change what I am doing. And so for the Federal Reserve to pay a higher price, or suppose it says, well, pay a higher price, but that means a decline in the interest rate, or decline in the yield. But if the interest rate is already zero, then that's gonna take it to negative values. And therefore you said, there's no point in me doing this. There is no difference from the standpoint of your asset composition between holding cash and holding treasuries. They are the same thing because both pay zero. Cash, however, still dominates treasury bills because cash has liquidity. You cannot go to the supermarket with a bunch of treasury bills. How much is it? 102. All right, here. Treasury bills are now legal tender. And so even though they're both paying zero, cash still dominates. And so this channel will not work. Okay. Which then brings us to the other channel. Purchases of treasury bonds from direct dealers or primary dealers. This is going to be very similar. So the government, or in this case the central bank, decides to increase its purchases of treasury bonds. And remember that when the central bank buys something, it pays in the act of the purchase. It's not that buy something, somebody's sent to a back room, bring the money, give it to the guy, we're done. There is no give the money to the guy. This is, I'm buying this stuff from you, and as I'm buying it, I'm writing on a piece of paper the amount of money that you ask for, and I'll give it to you. I have just created money. Now, I am doing this in a way that it is not modern. The way central bank is going to do is credit the accounts of these primary dealers. And as a result of that, the total asset of the central bank will increase. That's what you saw in that chart that Andrew prepared, where you saw the top line of the assets rising over time. We were creating money. The word creating is the operational word. That money was not somewhere else. We created it in the process. And this is not unique to the United States. This is a typical feature of every central bank. What differentiates a bank from a minister of finance or from a treasury department is that those guys do not have the power to create money. The central bank has that power. This used to be called seigniorage. The idea that seigniorage is a very medieval term, I think from France, where the government had the power to create money. That power was then delegated to the central bank. That's the difference between the central bank and the finance minister. And so how does it work? Well, the central bank increased demand for treasury bonds. It's going to raise the price of those bonds. The central bank says, Sharjeel, I know that you have those treasury bonds, and I know that you love them. You love them because your grandfather gave it to you when you were 9. And you have been holding on to them since then. And it is really difficult for you to let them go. Right? But listen, I have a really good deal for you. I'm going to give you twice the face value of them. And Sharjeel is going to go over this existential ambiguity in his life. You know, I'm giving something for the sake of money. I don't know. And then ultimately picks him up, right? It's like, I didn't like my grandfather, so I don't know. So the price of the treasury bonds rises. The moment that happens, the long-term rate falls, the real long-term falls, and therefore output expands. That's, if you want, the first element of an unconventional monetary policy. Conventionally, the conventional monetary policy acts on short-term treasury bills. That's the main tool. Unconventional monetary policy has been through long-term securities. In the case of the United States, and I think in the case of other central banks, in addition to the acquisition of long-term securities, central banks have been acquiring what's called mortgage-backed securities. Okay, so that's another component of the unconventional monetary policy. The acquisition of financial instruments that do not have the same safety or reputation that the government has. Citibank can go out of business. Lehman Brothers went out of business. The US government will not go out of business. That doesn't mean that it's going to be great, but it's not going to go out of business. All right? There's an annoying question here, however, in that what prevents from inflation expectations from increasing? Let's find out, Nandita. We're increasing the money supply in here. The long-term rate declines. What prevents inflation from increasing? We don't know. Let's see, Peter. No, Pete. Sorry.
An expectation that the Fed will bring down those assets?
Correct. So the reason why inflationary expectations remain anchored is because the central bank, as Ariel noted, keep telling us about those inflationary expectations being anchored. Okay? So that's part of the statement, or that's part of the mission of the statement. Now, to be frank with you, that would be really neat if you were just to take that statement in isolation. But they already have a track record of changing their mind, so why would they not change their mind again? Check this. These are the asset side of different central banks. relative to their nominal GDP. And so the Federal Reserve is the yellow dotted. The Bank of England, it looks like a twin sister for all I know, right? Just, and you thought that we were being aggressive, check the Bank of England, right? It's just like, we're gone. Then we have the Bank of Japan, which makes everyone else look timid, right? Because the Bank of Japan not only has been doing this, it has been doing it to a greater extent. Kenji, I'm sorry that I need to bring this in. They have been doing it to a greater extent and for longer. Right? And then we have the the ECB, which is this blue line here. Okay? So this issue of unconventional monetary policy is not U.S. centric. It's for all these countries. Now, go.
Which one's the asset that Argentina's having trouble with?
The Argentinian thing is a little trickier.
I mean, I get that they're just 1% of the year, so asking for the whole thing.
Yeah, the Argentinian thing is it's different. Argentina issued, the government of Argentina issued external obligations, and they a long time ago, in 2000. And they sold them to private investors, and in that transaction, the belief was that they were going to pay back an interest and pay back the principal. Okay? Then Argentina couldn't deliver on that promise, and then initiated what's called a default proceeding. And there, I'm simplifying now to a degree that it is really, it's almost like saying, I'm simplifying it tremendously. And so they said, look, we're not gonna be able to pay. What we can do is exchange those securities that you bought from us for other securities, and we're gonna sell you those at a different price. And so you're gonna be able to convert yours, and this is probably what it's gonna get to you, say 10 cents on the dollar. And so we give you 10 cents for every dollar that you borrow from me, that you lend to me, and you can use those to buy the new security. And some of the investors said, well, I don't have much of an alternative, so let's just go with that. But not all of it. And so some investors says, no, you promised us that you were gonna pay me interest and principal. And so we're not gonna buy that. Exhibit A. That thing went on for years. That's that. And so they go to law, they're in the courts and so on. Meanwhile, the Argentinians, if I understand this right, the Argentinian government was going to pay interest on the new debt. Okay? And at that point, the guys who were still holding the old debt said, like hell, you're gonna pay interest on the new debt and not on the old debt. And so, and the question is, where are these disputes settled? When countries, what's called sovereign loans, enter in a negotiation, and this is the thing that Wu was saying yesterday, that the first-tier financial centers are just that. So the government of Argentina did not have a choice to borrow in Mexico City. They had to borrow either in London or in New York. And when you borrow in New York, you're subject to the laws of the United States by design. It's not like, oh, what court are we going to? No, we knew that. CDC. So the guys who were still holding the papers from 2000 said, we're suing you. And so they went to federal court in the state of New York, and the federal court agreed with the lenders. The Argentinians were not all that touched by that, and they said, well, we're gonna take this all the way to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court agreed with the federal laws of New York, with the lower court. which meant that, well, it meant a couple of things. The first one is now you have a precedent for regulating transactions between sovereign lenders and sovereign borrowers and U.S. lenders. And at that point, you could say, who cares about what the Supreme Court says? Argentina could very well pay whatever it wants to whoever it wants. Argentina is not regulated by the laws of the United States. Until, say it again? Until you make this a little more real, and it says, well, how will Argentina pay, law or no law? Well, they have to use banks, and those banks will then have to use other banks, and it will ultimately be an American bank involved in the process. And so, right, that's right. It's not that Argentina is going to go around mailing dollars, right? Putting in dollars and saying UPS and here. They're going to send this stuff through banks. And if there's an American bank in the chain, that chain stops, because the bank will then effectively be disobeying the U.S. Supreme Court ruling. And so then Argentina says, well, this is crap, right? And so then the Americans were characterized as forfaiteurs and all kinds of bad things. And so they defaulted. That's the situation now. I don't know who's lending to Argentina now. They had a way. Is somebody here from Argentina? Because I just began. Coach, are you from Argentina? No? No? Okay. Because, no is the same in English and Spanish. No? All right. So, I don't know what the situation is right now. I assume that they're going to have to pay the original holders of that, because otherwise they're not going to be able to borrow, or they will borrow at a higher rate. And so the Argentinians went into what to me looks a little weird campaign of saying that, of being the victims. And so I didn't feel particularly comfortable with that. All right. But just want to be sure, that's not part of the unconventional policy. To be sure, that's part of what the Argentinians, how they have dealt in the management of their sovereignty. Did that more or less help? Let's look now a little more about the United States. So it's a little dated, it's February 13th. But check this. So these are the asset side. The blue line is total assets. And the red line is what we call security held outright. That's long-term purchase of treasury bonds. Then we have two additional categories, one of which is all liquidity facilities. Think of that as the discount window. And the other one is support for specific institutions. Think of that as Bear Stearns. Okay. All right. Check this. Look the blue line here. Look how steady that thing is. Right? What the Federal Reserve was doing that was, as it was extending what was thought to be at that point assistance to banks, was being offset by sales of U.S. Treasuries. So effectively, they were lowering this entry and raising the other. They were extending loans that they viewed to be necessary only to address a temporary situation. They didn't want the overall total assets to increase, and so they compensated by selling bonds. But then, then Lehman comes in, right? So this is right there. That little spot there is Lehman Brothers. And so these are all and 2 weeks later was AIG. So this is the assistance to them, which which then essentially translated into an increase in the assets. It took a while for the Federal Reserve to say, no, this is not gonna work. And so this, what you're seeing here, is the first installment of what's called quantitative easing. So they said, we're gonna raise the money supply. That's when the current situation began, right, raising the money supply. All right, and here's the other side of the balance sheet. You see this line in here, the blue line is what's called currency in circulation. So that's the amount of dollars in circulation. These are the reserves of private banks, and they just start increasing. And so there used to be, what could this number be? Let's just call it nothing. Because nothing and a little is the same thing. And by February of 13 was $1.6 trillion. This is spectacularly unconventional. I don't know how else to describe it to you. All right, so those are the facts, and the question is, I'm sorry. And the question, what the recent debate, this went up further, has been how to bring these assets to something that looks a little like this. And so they're saying, well, we're gonna start doing those actions in 13, 14, 15, whenever we get a chance. Start first. All right. Meanwhile, we now have to deal with the term structure of interest rates. And this is what we were invoked yesterday. Tuesday. And this is the thing that Jason found completely repugnant because it's just additive and not multiplicative multiplying. Right, Jason? Completely repugnant. And like, only idiots use this. Okay, fine. Well, this is a term structure for beginners, so words to that effect. All right. The difference between one of the reasons why Jason, or what I don't feel all that comfortable with it, is that he's assuming that the interest rates in the future are known. And so I'm not sure that the compounding helps in that case. But that's Jason's thing. Okay, next. So here's the structure. The structure says that the long-term, the interest rate n periods ahead is the arithmetic average of the expectations for the short rate n minus 1 period. I want you for a moment for you to think about how these bond traders, these guys that lend 2 or 3 billions in the morning and 2 or 3 billions in the afternoon, think. So the monetary policy went ahead and set the short-term rate effectively to 0. The next question is, does that imply by itself that the short rate will be 0 in the future? Because I can write this as saying 0 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. So there's nothing that guarantees that a short rate of 0 today means that the short rate will be 0 in the future. Another way of saying this, which has a little more bite, given that the interest rate is 0, the only thing that could happen to the interest rate is that it will increase. That's the only thing. It would be different if the interest rate was 5 and we're trying to figure out whether it can be 6 or 4. But when it's 0, it can only go up. And so the entire distribution is skewed towards positive values. So hence, that is where, that's what the central bank realizes, and the central bank says, we have to keep these terms in here as close to 0 for as long as possible. Because if we don't, then the long-term rate increases, the real long-term increases, and economic activity declines. Okay? And so there are a couple of things that I want to bring out in here. The first one is that when the short rate is 0, it can only increase. And so you are stacking the cards against the central bank. Hence the central bank reacts by saying we are going to maintain short rate for an extended period of time. We're gonna extend for a really, really long period of time. How long? 2013, 14, 15, way, it's just long, it's gonna be after the elections if you want. And they're doing this mental gymnastics to avoid this term from increasing. This term. All right? And what we're now in the process is the inability to predict when they will do this. All right. In effect, what the central bank is doing is sending a save our souls message. They're trying to shift the entire distribution of interest rate, of expectations of interest rate to the left. Okay? They're trying to change the expectation. This is not an exercise in noise reduction. This is an exercise of shifting the entire distribution to the left. Okay? Central bank, in particularly in unconventional monetary policy, is in the business of managing expectations. Expectations about the short-term rate in this case. And so there's nothing that anchors those rates other than a central bank promise that it will do so. All right. Oh, here's a statement. To warrant exceptionally low levels of the federal funds rate for an extended period. I brought this type of statement for you, so this is not like, oh wow, can they say that? You have been seeing this for. What I want is for you to connect this to the long-term interest rate. Is that they're trying to tell lenders of long-term securities that from the standpoint of the Federal Reserve, they can assume that the interest rate, the federal funds rate, is going to be zero for an extended period of time. What I'd like for you now is to take this and try to recraft it in terms of the Phillips curve references of the government that we used to have. There, the government made a promise about zero inflation going forward. And then, they said, yeah, that sounds like good. It sounds good. Let's do it. And then somebody says, have you checked our indifference curves lately? Because those indifference curves are really suggesting that we ought to take an expansionary policy, right? And so there they go, right? They cheat. The central banks now, they know of this potential. They don't want to just promise us and for us to say, Tanya, I am sorry to say this, for us to believe the central bank. We can't. I mean, we just can't, because they're just like you and I. If the incentives change, they'll change their behavior. All right. So we're now back to. We're now back effectively to Shelley. How can the central bank convince us that it will not change the interest rate in the future? What we had with the inflation issue, what we had Killen and Prescott making their little cameo here and saying, no, we have to use rules. And so we set the rules today forever, and so that pins down monetary policy. Then we say, well, those rules are not really all that practical to follow, or I don't even know what the function we will use to derive those rules. Then somebody else says, well, no, we don't need rules. What we need is a conservative central bank. Right? And then how do we do that? We don't. So what we do is design an incentive structure that replicates the behavior of a conservative central bank. We don't want that. And so then we go to the Taylor rule. Well, the Taylor rule has problems of its own, and that is where we are now. What prevents expectations of the short-term rate from increasing in the future, and therefore raising the long-term rate today? It is not that the long-term rate is going to increase in the future. It's going to increase today. What makes these little sentences that the central bank is writing down credible? Just because they come in bold things? Check this. So this is, we're gonna go now in the opposite direction. I want you to imagine that the central bank starts selling bonds. So this is what it used to be called the exit strategy. And the exit strategy was accompanied or decorated by the principles of the exit strategy. Or if you didn't like exit, you can say sometimes they use the word normalization. Okay? So here we go. The central bank starts selling bonds, and and they're selling the bonds to the primary dealers. And so the way to think about this transaction is that the central bank has on its books a bunch of treasury bonds that it's going to sell to somebody. But rather than hunting down for that someone, it sells to the primary dealer. So the primary dealers buy these bonds from the central bank, and so the Federal Reserve then debits their account. Okay, so reserve starts falling, and so the total asset side of the balance sheet starts declining. All right. Here comes the music. What we're doing now is to show you that in the act of this unconventional policy, it had built in by design a Schelling-like scheme. Watch. Do you remember the little thing about Sharjeel having these treasury bonds that his grandfather gave to him, and that he really liked them? And then I said, Sharjeel, you're 50 years old. Come on, let that one go. I'm giving you a good deal on this. So I, the central bank, paid Sharjeel a good amount of money. So when I bought those treasury bonds, I paid, let's say, more than their face value. So if the face value was 100, I gave Sharjeel 130 for that bond. He still feels crappy about the idea of giving up the grandfather thing, but well, fine. So he's richer now. Okay. We're okay with this when we bought it. All right, now it's time to sell. We're selling the bonds. Now, selling those bonds, I need now to convince Sharjeel that his loyalty to his grandfather was genuine. Would he be interested in buying these bonds back? He said, yeah. At what price? Right? Well, then I have to sell at a lower price, right? Because he says, I got money, and I don't want those bonds. I already broke the emotional bond that I have with my grandfather. I don't want that. And so then he says, well, if you give me a really low price, then I go along. Here comes a trick. When the Federal Reserve starts doing this, then they're incurring losses. Right? Because they bought high and selling low. They bought the securities at a high price, and they're going to start selling at a low price. And so you see this double arrow down, that's going to be a valuation effect. Okay, it is akin to you to have a piece of real estate in this beautiful field, forest, lake, trees, dogs, the whole thing. And then you learn that there's going to be a highway in front of it. Well, you just took a hit. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. And so, you haven't sold the house. The value of it just declined. And so, the value of the asset side of the Federal Reserve is declining for two reasons. First, they're getting rid of the bonds. And two, the act of getting rid of the bonds means that the price of those bonds have to be lower, and so there's a valuation effect. Lexi.
I just have a quick question on it.
Go.
Are they actually increasing the coupon on the two bonds, or are they selling it at a lower principal rate?
The latter. The latter. I will edit that in just a little bit. Let me go with the narrative of the hell is about to visit us, and then I damp it down a little bit. And so the asset side is declining, but Jack, Lexi, primary dealers are not taking the hit. It's the capital of the central bank that takes the hit. Right? The dealer is saying, I'm buying this crap at 80. Don't give me anything about price valuation stuff. And so the capital comes in. And so central banks are not really all that big of a deal. They're not really enamored of being insolvent. which is what this is all about. Now, like I said, the central bank does not have to sell the bonds, strictly speaking. The central bank could let the bonds mature, and so they automatically leave the balance sheet of the central bank. And so in that case, there is no valuation effect, because when the bond matures, the central bank gets back the face value. And so what this is doing is essentially saying we need to be out of this process by 2013. Oh wait, we can't. It's by 2014. Oh, that would be an even bigger loss. Oh, it's 2015. So it is the active sale of these bonds, not just letting them mature. Okay. Did that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure, Professor.
Yeah.
So, as time goes by, is the valuation effect going to decrease?
Decrease.
Yes, because you said if we do not sell it at all, if we do not take action, in the end there won't be any valuation effect.
Correct.
If we do it now, we have a high.
Valuation.
Okay.
Let me add a little twist, and this is now really important, mostly for the United States. I don't know the procedure in other central banks. In the case of the United States, the question that arises is, how is the Federal Reserve System financing its cost, financing its operation? Okay. In some cases, the Parliament or the Congress approves the funds for the central bank, and the central bank has to use those funds. In the case of the United States, that's not the case of the United States. These little treasury bonds and treasury bills, the Federal Reserve collects interest on that. So that's the revenue of the central bank. Out of that revenue, a chunk gets parsed out to finance the cost of the Federal Reserve. Salaries, computers, building, water, electricity, and the rest. The rest is sent to U.S. Treasury. If we call that remittance to the U.S. Treasury or profits. Okay? Now, if the Federal Reserve starts incurring losses in those transactions, then what they're going to be able to send to Treasury is smaller. And Treasury will be royally pissed. Royally pissed. And so will Congress. And so this is, it's not just an accounting trick that we have to be aware of. This has ramifications for the rest of the system. And so because, and so here comes Sheldon, because the central bank knows that if it starts reneging on its promise of keeping interest rates low, it will incur a loss, then it doesn't change its promise. It doesn't renege its promise. Okay? So the shelling, the self-restraint was built in. It's not that the central bank at a later date said, oh, we have to invite Sheldon to give a conference in here to tell us what to do. They knew it from the beginning, okay? By design. It was not an accident. It's like, oh, check this out, looks like Sheldon. No, it was by design. All right. So that's how you can be sure that the central bank is not going to cheat on this. It's not going to initiate the exit strategy too soon. What I'd like to do now is to talk about this speech from Jerry Yellen. What I want to emphasize is that unconventional monetary policy has two parts: the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve and the communication strategy. So what we have been doing now was the balance sheet. We did a little while ago the communication strategy. And so the first question that I think she asked is, how do we know for sure, or how can we persuade ourselves that this communication strategy, that this forward guidance is real? I mean, it's one thing for us to convince ourselves that it is, and it's another for there to be correct. All right. What you're seeing here is the evolution of the expected path of the federal funds rate Okay, so this, who the hell determines this expected path? These guys. Okay, they're a collection of individuals who make a living at about forecasting what the federal funds rate would be. And so these are their forecasts. Okay? And the red dashed line was where they were forecasting in December of 2008, and this is what they were forecasting in February 1 of 2009. You can see how the whole thing shifted down. Now, this whole thing may have shifted down because it was a cloudy day, but may have shifted down because President Obama took the wrong turn, it was traffic, and oh my God, right? But the guys at the Fed like to think of this as forward guidance and action. This is what they mean by saying, we're going to keep the short-term rate at zero forever, or for an extended period of time. The private sector doesn't have to believe this. And what you're seeing in here is in effect that they are believing it, so much so that they're willing to forecast it. So, okay? All right, check this. I think you're gonna see my point in a moment. Okay. So here is the evolution of the forecast federal funds rate as of April 1, 2010. So they thought that the problem was gonna be, that the Federal Reserve was going to maintain this policy, and then it was gonna raise the interest rate all the way to 2.5. This is in April of 2010. Then this is in August of 2010. So notice the decline in the forecast for the short-term rate. And then in November of 2010, there's an even greater decline. All right. I hope I don't make a royal fool of myself now, but I see here November 3, 2010, and I see that, well, it's not clear to me which one is. I want to think that it is this. Check to the right now. This is November 3, 2010. And it doesn't look the same to me as this. That's what I mean. It's meant to be the same.
It's the same. Because the
No,
starting
it's not
point.
the same because this goes above 0.5, this is less than 0.5.
That's in
No, but that's
2013.
2013. This
So
one
it's
is
just
2012.
You see what I mean? This is suffering when I start finding mistakes that they're not really there. Okay, so I looked at the yen in here and, okay, good, thank you. This is my life, man. It's just a bunch of disappointments. All right. I don't know why the interest rate went back to this much later on. Okay, now comes, this is gonna be a part that it is really annoying about the work of monetary policy or the work of fiscal policy. Now we say, we're going to do this, or we did this, and then somebody says, or it didn't work. For example, many people will say that the expansion in the money supply of the Federal Reserve has been completely ineffective. Has been completely ineffective because we're going even less than we used to, even though we more than quadruple the size of the balance sheet. I mean, we just tons of money. Okay. And so the question is, well, how do you argue against that? The way one normally argue against that is by saying you should have seen the alternative. But the alternative was never seen. The alternative was never seen because monetary policy took action. And so the issue is, well, that's not really all that persuasive. You tell me that we ought to be happy with ourselves because if instead of because I could have been much worse. And so to the extent that I'm not that much worse as an individual, I ought to be happy with my limitations. So people don't find that, or I don't find that all that persuasive. And so what's done is to craft hypothetical alternatives. And hypothetical alternatives are based on not unlike the simulations that you did for the first assignment and not unlike the simulations you did for the last assignment. So you have a model, in this case, in today's assignment was a Taylor rule. In the first assignment was Taylor rule plus a function of aggregate demand and so on. And so what you can do with that kind of model is to see what would have happened if the assumptions that I maintained were different. And so in that first assignment, you saw that targeting inflation rate, if nothing else, induces greater volatility in output. We didn't get to see that volatility. And so what we're doing here is, the Federal Reserve has this really big model called this. It's really big, and convoluted and complicated. And so they say to it, let's assume, let's examine what would happen in 2016 if we were to use the market expectation of the federal funds rate. So this is what the market was expecting. And so that assumption creates a baseline. The same way that you created a baseline in the first assignment. Then they change. Okay. And so this then becomes the blue line. So instead of raising the interest rate at this point, they delayed increasing the interest rate by this much, and then they compensate a little at the end. What would be the effect of that? Well, it would have, and so what you're seeing here are the effects on the unemployment rate, the solid line, and the inflation rate, the dashed line. That was going to, delaying this was going to raise the inflation rate a little bit, so initially, because by delaying the increase in the interest rate, economic activity keeps expanding, and so the inflation rate increases. And it was going to lower unemployment rate. Notice that these movements are not going to be forever. So, okay. Another possibility is to, so far, I'll show you what happens with the short-term rate, the federal funds rate, and the implications of looking at the alternatives using that. I mentioned last time that one of the things that people at the Fed do, especially the guys in the financial sector, is conduct what's called event studies. So they know that there's going to be a decision announced on the FOMC at a particular time and date, right, at 2:15. So they start measuring the values of the foreign exchange, the value of the long-term rate, all the tips, the mortgage-backed securities. They start measuring that minute by minute by minute, beginning 2 hours before the announcement. The announcement comes in, and they start measuring for 2 hours afterwards. The idea is to see whether individuals' expectations as the announcement came in started realigning themselves, and then what happens, there's so much the announcement effect, how it was first interpreted. Oh my God, these guys moved the date to 2015, we're royally screwed. And they start selling right there. Or, no, maybe it's not so bad. Let's just think about this before we take losses. All right. And so here you have the effects of those announcements on the 10-year treasury, on the 10-year tips, the mortgage-backed securities, and the corporate yield, the triple D. Check this. This number is considerably bigger than the other ones. And it is because it was the first announcement of the quantitative easing. It was on that date when the Federal Reserve, you know those little idiotic statements that I've been showing you? They said, check this, we're gonna be buying everything that is not nailed down. Whoa, right? So people anticipated that was going to raise the demand for long-term securities, the price of those securities was going to increase. And therefore the yield declined. Let me see if I have, oh, you're gonna love this. This is another episode in comparing two hypothetical worlds. A again, remember, this is, oh, I don't know. I want to compare unicorns against another creature that does not exist. Ariel, what would that creature be? Pegasus. So I have unicorns and Pegasus. And we're gonna ask what most people believe to be an idiotic question. Which of the two runs faster? Don't know. Basically, so that is what we're about to do. Okay, so here we go. Remember, this was done in 2011. So this is about now. So the blue line denotes what the Federal Reserve anticipates doing. And then here, notice, this is the sales of treasuries that I was talking a moment ago. Notice how gradual and organized this is. It's beautiful, right? So that's a scenario that they have in mind. So it is a unicorn. The other one is this, that it is, what would have happened if we didn't undertake that expansionary policy? Instead, we imagine that we follow a rule that we increase the assets according to a strict rule, no deviation from it. Okay, no wiggles. Unemployment is too large. Well, sorry. Factories are closing down. General Motors going out of business. Bear Stearns is gone, and so is even. We follow a rule. And if you have any complaint about the rule, talk to Koshu about the whole thing. That's what a following rule means, right? Just do that. All right. And so, what will be the implications of this? Of having done the blue line compared to what was not done, the dashed line. Okay. So what you're seeing here is the unemployment rate under the blue line. Okay. And so it rises, and then but rather declines steadily. So you can see from this blue line, why would the Federal Reserve be saying something about the unemployment rate 6.5? They did this. And they didn't pick the 6.5 out of like, well, we need a number. Jeff, what number? 6.5. No, they had a number. And so notice 6.5 is right there, and it is about to be, according to this, towards the end of 2015. So it is not, so the thing is calculated. Had they followed instead no asset purchases, they would have, the unemployment rate would have been, according to this, well above the blue line throughout. Conclusion, Pegasus run faster than unicorns. Because we're comparing two alternatives that have not taken place. And we're just shifting the burden of proof to a model that nobody knows. Okay? Let me make sure that I'm clear on this. Right. There's a model, and the model is going to generate two views of the world. One is called Pegasus, the other one is called unicorns. And we're going to ask which of this is higher, or which of this is faster. This has not taken place. And so we have now transferred the burden of credibility to a model. All right. Well, what about the inflation rate? So this is the one that actually happened. All right. And then the inflation rate would have increased a little more. It would have gone a little above the target of 2%. Do you think that this inflation rate stabilizing around 2% is an accident? Do you think that this is the sort of thing that, look at it, the damn thing goes steady towards 2%, precisely the target that we are saying? That's not an accident. That's why I'm calling this a unicorn versus a Pegasus. Let me put it slightly different. This is what they are assuming. And then they're telling us this is the implied results for the inflation rate. The next question that arises is, why not? Why not this? Or why not that? Is there something magic about that blue line? No, there isn't. They probably tried this and that. And they probably were not getting to the 2% inflation rate. And so notice how things are working, right? We cannot have a path of, we cannot have an exit strategy that contradicts the target rate. To the extent that the target is biblical, and to the extent that the blue line is our choice, we're going to nail the path of sales of treasuries so as to be consistent with the inflation rate of 2%. Okay, and I think, oh, this is another one. This is pretty much the other thing that, you know, instead of doing it one way, they do it. This to me sounds like a long way of saying trust us. I personally don't. Not that I distrust what they do by nature, is that it is relying on something that I cannot check for myself. And so to that extent, what I want for you is not so much to believe or disbelieve. What I want is for you to be detached, to be impartial, to say, show me, what's the evidence? How do I know that what you're doing is correct? So it isn't like being like me, like, I don't, no matter what you say, I believe it's an error. Don't be that way, because that's just it's an invitation to heaven also. So rather be detached. Did they show you any evidence? No. They're making an appeal to a US model. Okay, so there's the US model they're talking about. What's the tracking record of that model? Is it any good? How do we know? We don't. Or at least they're not showing it to us. But if the model is crappy, aren't then the associated implications from that model just as crappy? Yes. Okay. Enough. Give me a moment to show you something that this is going to take a second. Or depending on the server. Just give me a moment here. Show you something that I unfortunately deleted. Now you know my password. I'll write it down. Okay. Okay, so this is the balance sheet. This is the honest to God, regular looking balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. It has really, it's a really complicated thing. And so what Andrew did, we downloaded this. What he did was it's in the, you can have access to this. What I was curious about it was, are these guys really following the tapering thing? So notice securities held or right. So there's going to be U.S. Treasuries, agency securities, and mortgage-backed securities. This begins in 2006, the days of glory. Everything was great in the United States and abroad for that matter, right? And so let's scroll down. This is on a weekly basis, and in the United States it's Wednesdays. And so what are we having here? This is when Lehman went down, September of 2008. And so the first thing that think of this as Fannie Mae. Right? Notice that we're still not buying mortgage-backed securities. Then we started buying mortgage-backed securities. And then what I was curious was about this U.S. Treasuries. Notice that this is the period where they were trying to offset the expansion in these components. And so, are these guys tapering or what? So let me just go there for a moment. So what I'm gonna do is, let's put this. So notice how they're still buying. Okay?
Slow pace.
But it's getting smaller. Right? And so the policy decisions in the United States is not to stop buying. The policy decisions are about to stop buying as much. Right? And so, and then I said, oh yeah, they're doing the same. The other thing that I want you to see here is how, just looking at those numbers, if you look at the numbers in here, they are really, let's just take this student here. These are not so much the positions, these are the flows. So these are the actual purchases of treasuries, right? And so notice that it is not nearly as regular. I mean, it's like, it's 215, let's just combine it. Because part of the thing that is going on is that some of these securities are maturing, and so they exited the balance sheet, and so they have to take into account that. And so that's why you get to see this volatility. But I think that there is a downward trending here. Not 2 billions per minute or nothing smooth, but you know, this is the sort of thing that people are doing to check what the central bank is doing. You're not going to take their word at face value. You're going to check. Now, at that point, you can say, and how, to the extent that the central bank is releasing these numbers, how do I trust those numbers? Fine. You can. All right. Want to have lunch? Or you want me to keep talking? Or you want me to have lunch and talk? Where's the room? Is in the top room?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
So the reason they don't take it
Wait, you've never done Bitcoin?
Let's go home and sleep yesterday. Just go home and sleep yesterday. And then get worked out for next summer. One of the things is to start a
Oh shit.